All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Going to do another delusional episode today. And of course, we got Chief Keefe back, aka Tim Keefe. And we're going to go through another essay from the book called Deleuze's Philosophical Lineage, which is about Deleuze's thoughts on the 20th century French philosopher Raymond Ruyer, I believe, is the way you told me is the correct way to pronounce his name, Tim.
I think it's Ruyer. It's Ruyer.
Ruyer? Ruyer? Okay.
Ruyer.
Ruyer.
Ruyer. Yeah.
Ruyer.
Yeah. Close enough.
Okay. All right. So, do you want to start off with an introduction to him and go into Deleuze's thoughts on him from there?
Sure can. Okay. So there isn't too much out there on Ruyer because I only found two of his books, which are, I think they came out in the late 60s or 70s that were translated into English. There was a collection of other ones too. And Ruyer was active, let's see. So just to go to the Lineage book, this is essay number 16, starting on page 300 by Ronald Bogue. And let's see. Well, let's go ahead and read the biography on him because this is the best place that I've seen it. All right. Bogue says, born in 1902, Raymond Ruyer began his studies at the École Normale Supérieure in 1921, completing his Docteur et Lettres in 1930. For most of his career, he taught at the University of Nancy. Ruyer's doctoral thesis appeared in 2 volumes in 1930. L'Humanité de l'avenir d'après Cournot, which is Humanity of the Future according to Cournot, a study of the philosophy of Antoine-Augustin Cournot, and Sketch of a Philosophy of the Structure, in which Ruyer developed Cournot's insight into the centrality of structure as the guiding light in all objective cognitive investigation. In the course of pursuing this line of thought, however, Ruyer came to recognize the need for distinguishing structure, or the disposition and operation of already functioning components, from form, or the self-generating and self-sustaining relation among elements such as one encounters in biological entities. The rest of Ruyer's career may be seen as a continuing meditation on that distinction and its implications in the domains of epistemology, ontology, axiology, and theology. Axiology is the study of values, by the way.
Okay.
In 1937, Ruyer turned to the venerable mind-body problem in his La conscience et le corps, conscience and the body, here articulating for the first time his key notion of consciousness as a self-forming form in overflight, which is a translation of the French survol, across an absolute surface or absolute domain. Okay. From 1940 to 45, Ruyer was interned at Oflag, 17A, a German army prisoner of war camp for officers. In this remarkable prison camp, the inmates, many of them distinguished scholars, established their own university. And besides teaching his own courses, Ruyer advanced his studies in biology with the eminent scientists Alexis Moyes and M. Etienne Wolff, among others. By the way, important French intellectuals who had formed their own universities and taught the prisoners, that wasn't just with Ruyer.
Oh, cool. I didn't even know that was a thing. So how big of a thing was it?
I'm not quite sure. The only other guy that I know of who did that was Paul Ricoeur.
Okay. His name sounds familiar, but why does it sound familiar to me?
French hermeneutics.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how common this was. It probably was fairly common in certain spots because, if you're a prisoner, if you're in a prison or war camp, what else you got to do?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. During his internment, Ruyer drafted the text of a systematic exposition of his philosophy of biology, which was published in 1946 as Éléments de psychobiologie, Elements of Psychobiology. Further elaborations of this philosophy appeared in Neo-Finalism, or Neo-Finalism, and La Genèse des Formes Vivantes, The Genesis of Living Forms. By the way, Neo-Finalism and The Genesis of Living Forms are the only 2 books I know of that have been translated into English.
Okay.
So these date from the 50s. His consideration of living entities as goal-directed agents led him to develop a general theory of values, which he articulated in Le Monde des Valeurs, the world of values, in Philosophie de la Valeur, the philosophy of value. And in his reflection on the differences between organisms and machines, inspired both La cybernétique et l'origine de l'information, cybernetics and the origin of information, and paradoxes of the conscience and the limits of automatism. In his later work, Ruyer turned to the examination of social and political issues, first situating human culture within the biological world in L'animal, l'homme, la fonction symbolique, animal, man, the symbolic function, and then considering the consequences of that position in 4 subsequent volumes from 1969 to 79. Perhaps Ruyer's moment of greatest public attention came in 1974, with the publication of his La gnose de Princeton, des savants et recherches d'une religion. My French is getting worse by the year. The Gnosis of Princeton, of the learned and the search of a religion. That's the translation. In which he playfully reported his transactions with a purported organization of American scientists intent on formulating a new religion compatible with contemporary science. On his death in 1987, he was at work on a manuscript titled L'embryogenèse du monde, the embryogenesis of the world, which is yet to appear in print. Okay. So Ruyer was active in philosophy of biology, more or less.
Okay.
Okay, good so far?
Yeah. What remind me of what those 2 terms there that I didn't remember the meaning of, gnosis and embryogenesis, I think it was that you said?
Right, gnosis. So gnosis referring to, you know what a Gnostic is? You've ever heard that term?
I remember learning about Gnostic Christianity before. Is it something like having a lot of pagan elements or something like that?
Not exactly. It comes from gnosis, which is a Greek term referring to his secret knowledge.
Okay.
Okay. So the Gnostic Christians were those that they were Christian, but they had a certain outlook on Christianity as a whole. And this is where the scholars really started to learn more about the Gnostic Christians from the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls several decades ago. That's the closest
right.
reference there.
Right. Okay.
Right. So a certain kind of secret or revealed knowledge to only of the initiates, more or less. You know,
Okay.
I'm not going to go into too many details about that. So embryogenesis is dealing with the genesis of an embryo. You know what an embryo is, right?
Yeah, it's what grows into a fetus.
Right. And it could be a human fetus, or it could be an animal fetus or something else. That's what the embryo is. Starting from cells, then the embryo, then the organism itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So continuing on. This is on page 301. Beau continues. One might loosely describe Ruyer's philosophy of biology as a Leibniz-inspired panpsychism, though Ruyer preferred the terms psychobiology and neo-finalism to characterize his position, since panpsychism carries with it romantic mystical connotations he sought to avoid. Okay, so panpsychism, loosely defined, is the psyche of a spirit or mind permeating throughout entire reality. Okay?
Right.
So the key point here is he avoided the term panpsychism because it's had a romantic mystical connotation. He instead was using psychobiology and neo-finalism.
So do those words have any functional difference, or or is he just using the different words to avoid those connotations?
Well, I think they might have a different function. So if you're talking about psychobiology, a biological base, panpsychism doesn't necessarily take any kind of biology into account. Maybe it does, as in all organisms within the world, within the universe, are suffused with some kind of psyche or some kind of spirit.
Right.
That's a generative spirit,
And
it's found all throughout reality.
in panpsychism, do I remember correctly that it involves even inanimate objects having some sort of consciousness?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So he preferred the term psychobiology and neo-finalism. So next page, page 302. Okay, so here's an interesting little reference here. Bogue continues. The hidden and mistaken assumption in most analyses of consciousness is that consciousness must be observed as an object in order to be understood. Okay, let me read this again. The hidden and mistaken assumption in most analyses of consciousness is that consciousness must be observed as an object in order to be understood.
So what would be alternative ways to looking at it?
Well, that's a good question. So continuing, we'll get to that. So here's an example that Bogue references from Edwin A. Abbott, who in 1884 wrote a very interesting novel titled Flatland. Okay. So Edwin A. Abbott, in his popular and widely discussed Flatland, which is from 1884, imagines what the world would be like for creatures who inhabit a two-dimensional space, such as the surface of a piece of paper. If they encountered a circle inscribed on the surface, they would experience it as an impenetrable wall, and they would be unable to comprehend it as a circle, at least as we understand circles. If, however, an inhabitant of flatland were able to rise above the surface into a third dimension, that individual would have no difficulty surmounting the supposed wall of the circle and would gain a full understanding of flatland's geometrical characteristics. So the plot of the novel Flatland, I remember reading it many years ago, is that you have these characters that inhabit a two-dimensional space, but one of them happens to rise above that into the third dimension, and it changes everything for that individual.
Cool. I should read that. That sounds interesting.
Yeah. So reading this again, if, however, an inhabitant of flatland were able to rise above the surface into a third dimension, that individual would have no difficulty surmounting the supposed wall of the circle and would gain a full understanding of flatland's geometrical characteristics. Abbott's purpose is to propose that a fourth dimension would provide the same transformed perspective for those of us who inhabit a three-dimensional world. But Ruyer's use of this parable is to suggest that analyses of consciousness typically assume the necessity of something like a fourth dimensional observer to understand consciousness. As an example, Ruyer imagines an adult seated at a checkerboard patterned table, looking at the table surface. The standard assumption is that an observer, a disembodied I of some sort, whether just behind the adult's head or inside his head, must be invoked in order to describe consciousness. Of course, such reasoning leads to an infinite regress, since the additional I must itself be observed by yet another I, ad infinitum. Ruyer insists, however, that consciousness does not operate this way. The seated adult is an immediate possession of the table surface of its perception. Indeed, there is no difference between perceiving subject and perceiving object, between having the perception and being the perception. Contrary to Husserlian phenomenological analyses, consciousness is not consciousness of something. Consciousness is something.
Ah, okay.
Okay,
I like that.
let's review for a minute. When we looked at the Husserlian essay, Husserl took up the notion of intentionality from Franz Brentano. Intentionality is that characteristic of consciousness that it is always directed at something. Consciousness is of something. It could be a physical object. It could be a dream. It could be a feeling. It could be a sound. It could be many different things that appear in consciousness. But when we say that I am conscious, we are always conscious of something. Okay? That's Husserl. So what Ruyer is saying here is that consciousness is something. There is no distinction between a subject and an object.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
So then he mentions Abbott's parable in Flatland is that just as the two-dimensional individual rose above into the three dimension and has a new understanding of what Flatland is. So in the case of consciousness, we do not have to assume that there's a fourth dimensional observer to understand consciousness. Rather, we are understanding consciousness within consciousness itself.
So does that mean that do you think that he's implying that consciousness is easier to understand than we might have previously thought for that reason?
Possibly. I mean, if you're taking consciousness that consciousness is something, then you're avoiding the infinite regress, which definitely Husserl had fallen into, because, again, to review, is that when we bracket reality from the natural standpoint, which is, here's an apple, we describe it in the natural standpoint, but if we bracket that, we're just observing it as an object of consciousness, that what is actually doing the observing? This is where the transcendental ego came into the picture. Okay, so the transcendental ego is what one is aware of, perceiving the object in a bracketed sense, under the epoche, as Husserl called it. But then you start to ask a question, what's behind the transcendental ego? Now you see where there's a problem with an infinite regress, because then you're going to be, well, what's behind that? What's behind that? What's behind that? What's behind that? Okay. So by saying consciousness is something, you're avoiding that in infinite regress.
Okay, so you can't view it from that transcendental perspective of the transcendental ego.
Well, you could, but again, it's the infinite regress.
Right.
Okay. Because let's use another term. So let's say that you have a self. Okay. The self is what is doing the perception. All right. So perception begins with the self. But if you perceive yourself, you say that I'm aware of myself. Now you could take the Humean tack and say all it is just a bundle of perceptions, but we'll put that aside for the moment. If I'm perceiving myself, or I claim to perceive myself, then what is perceiving myself?
Right. Is he saying that consciousness is what is perceiving yourself, or is he just saying that that consciousness happens and it's like, well, like you were saying, it's a mistake to view it as being conscious of something?
Right. Now, sure, we could say that I'm conscious of your voice, but I guess one could even say that that's adding to an abstraction. Okay, I am conscious of, I'm using language to describe this, but I'm still conscious. I'm conscious. I'm a conscious being.
So like, I am conscious.
I'm conscious. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And is that part of why philosophers, well, I'm sure many other reasons too, but is that part of why philosophers still today just debate about what consciousness is?
Sure. They can't seem to put their finger on what consciousness is. Is it, well, first of all, does it exist? If you say that it exists, then what are its qualities? Does consciousness possess these qualities in and of themselves, or what do you do about the brain? Is consciousness an epiphenomenon of the brain? Any kind of a mental process is just it supervenes, the term is, which means that it rides upon, in other words, of a physical process.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're like, so what you're saying is that consciousness is a brain state? Well, not necessarily, because you can observe a brain state, but is that consciousness? You see where they get tangled up into this? Because in order to define consciousness, you're referring to something else, but by referring to something else, then you seem to be getting yourself into a thicket in terms of describing consciousness. So they still have not been able to really say what consciousness is.
Yeah, that can be well, it can present problems with the sort of materialistic, reductionist, scientific explanation of consciousness as an emergent phenomenon of the brain and as a brain state, as you said. Like, I think people like Daniel Dennett argue that.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, just one other point is that Daniel Dennett in the late 80s talked quite a bit about intentionality. And in fact, I used as one book, The Intentional Stance, in my master's thesis. But he
Cool.
he took intentionality a little bit further than just a consciousness. Intentionality was a directedness behavior of an organism.
Okay.
Okay. Won't get into that. It's an interesting take on it. I don't know if he's revised his position because I haven't followed Dennett that closely over the years, but I do remember that.
Okay.
Okay. So pressing on, let's go to page 303. Bogue continues. Okay, talking about the checkerboard squares here. So he says, the table's checkerboard squares, when considered from the vantage of a single square, are interrelated by mere contiguity, which is this square abuts this square, abuts this square, abuts this square. They're connected. Well, they're actually next to each other. They're not necessarily connected. That's what contiguity is. Or in Ruyer's favorite phrases, partes extra partes, a Latin phrase meaning parts outside parts. And then a French phrase, de proche en proche, literally from close to close, perhaps idiomatically approximated as by degrees, closer and closer, little by little or piece by piece. And even when considered de proche en proche, contiguous squares are not genuinely connected to one another. If a given square were to be connected to an adjoining square, rather than simply juxtaposed against an opposing surface, some sort of glue would need to hold them together. But this glue, when considered as discrete molecules partes extra partes, again meaning parts outside parts, would itself require a glue of some kind to connect its components. Okay, makes sense so far?
Yep.
Okay, continuing. What this ultimately suggests to Ruyer is that connections are always inferred, never observed. The difference between a structure and a form is that a structure may be observed, but only as a collection of entities partes extra partes, whereas a form is a set of interconnected elements whose liaisons, the connections, cannot be observed. Most scientific analyses of phenomena, focused as they are on observation, deal with structures and ignore forms, and implicit in such analyses is an essentially mechanistic understanding of the world as a collection of entities interacting de proche en proche.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm still a little unclear on the distinction between those two things.
Okay. Let's go ahead and unpack this. So let me read the last sentence again. Most scientific analyses of phenomena, focused as they are on observation, deal with structures and ignore forms. And implicit in such analyses is an essentially mechanistic understanding of the world as a collection of entities interacting de proche en proche. Okay. So let's take something simple, water. All right. So if we are studying water scientifically, it's a phenomenon. It's an object, liquid. We're focusing on observation. What is water? So water is a liquid. Actually, water can exist in more than one form. Aha. Notice I said form. There's liquid, solid, and a gas. But what is water except H2O? Two hydrogen molecules connected to an oxygen molecule. Now that's getting down to a mechanistic understanding, really down to the atomic, possibly even the subatomic level. Okay.
Right.
That's observing water on that level. But notice when I talked about forms, water can also exist in different forms. Is it in a liquid form? Is it in a gaseous form? Is it in a solid form? Well, it depends on the movement of the molecules internally within water. Okay. So the point here is that scientific analyses are focusing just on structures. Water is a structure of molecules, a structure of atoms, but it's ignoring the form of it, of water. Or to take another example, any kind of say like a gaseous state, it doesn't have to be water vapor. It could be smoke, steam. No, steam wouldn't be a good example. Smog, smoke, Can't think of anything else at the time. But you're observing it as a structure. What constitutes the smoke? What is it made of? So you're getting down in the observation, and it's a structure of particulate matter, heat, whatever it is, but it's ignoring the form of the smoke. Okay. This is making sense so far?
Yeah, I think so. So the structure is something like how it's composed, and the form is something like how the thing itself, like what specific type of that thing itself it actually is, without reducing it down to its separate characteristics that compose it, something like that.
Yeah, that's close. Another example that just come to mind is think of a puzzle. Okay. You can observe a puzzle as the form, but you can also observe the puzzle as a collection of pieces, the structure. Right. Okay. It's almost like a you miss the forest for the trees type of thing.
Right.
Okay. I guess that's another way. I guess that's a simpler way that you can describe it. Is you're missing the forest for the trees.
Okay.
You're ignoring the form of the forest by focusing on the structure, on the arrangement of the trees, and saying this is the forest.
Right. Okay.
All right, so continuing, Bogue says, yet connections genuinely exist, and though they cannot be observed, they can be known, directly through our experience of consciousness, and indirectly through our recognition of consciousness as the fundamental force de liaison, the force of connection, throughout the physical world.
Okay.
So as I read that, is consciousness is what stitches everything together. Okay. Makes sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
All right, next page. Well, actually, we'll continue that page. Ruyer finds support for this view in the discoveries of quantum physics, according to which atomic particles are less things than activities, zone of forces sustaining a given form. An atom is not a structure, but a structuring activity. And when atoms combine to form a molecule, the connecting and interacting electrons are not localizable. Modern chemists speak of molecular bonds in terms of maps of electronic density. And according to this model, in a given molecule, two regions neighboring in the map of electronic density can jointly structure one another according to their energy of interaction and resonance. Thus, the molecule is a domain where energies interchange, where energy structures itself, where a structural state chooses itself among an essential multiplicity of possible states.
Okay.
Makes sense so far?
Yep.
Okay, let's unpack this a little bit. So, quantum physics, that gets below atomic particles, subatomic particles. Okay. So we have the form of something, we have the molecules, which in turn are made up of the atomic particles, and then the quantum particles. Okay. The quantum particles help to form the atom. It's not a structure, but it's a structuring activity because the molecules are coming together, engendering the atom. Same thing for atoms coming together to engender the molecule, and the molecules coming together to engender whatever the thing is. Could be water, could be a solid, could be another element. No, take your pick. But, here's a Deleuzian term we've seen before, a multiplicity. Okay.
Right.
So a multiplicity, it is not everything coming together. It is rather like conjoining different things there. Choosing itself, in Ruyer's terms, is that this is how they choose. You're kind of giving agency to non-conscious particles here, coming together, possible states, where, if you remember your chemistry is that with H2O for water, if you add another oxygen atom, it becomes something different.
Yeah.
Okay. And we see this getting down to the chemical level where a certain substance is there, and maybe it attracts another molecule, an atom from some other substance that's in the neighborhood, and then it forms something else.
Mm-hmm.
So it's choosing this state, an essential multiplicity of possible states. Could be this, changes to this, the atom spins off again, then it goes back to whatever its original state was. Okay?
Is the word choosing meant to imply intentionality?
That's the tricky part. Ruyer seems to be imputing agency, intentionality to these molecules. It's hard to read that. Maybe
Okay.
it's a poor choice of words, but I think what he's trying to get here is that maybe it's not as random as one thinks they are.
Okay.
Okay. So
Okay.
continuing, Bogue says, atoms, in short, are genuine forms, self-sustaining activities in which there is no distinction between shape and force, between what it is and what it does. Molecules have a structure, since their components may be observed, but they too are forms, in that they are self-sustaining activities whose interconnecting liaisons are unobservable. Every form, from atoms to molecules, viruses, bacteria, and more complex organisms, is a self-sustaining configuration of forces of connection. Each of these forms, according to Ruyer, is a consciousness. Identifying form with consciousness must at first seem far-fetched. But Ruyer's point is that not all the attributes of human consciousness are present in atoms. Rather, he argues that human consciousness is merely a complex, highly developed, self-aware version of the primary self-forming activity that manifests itself in varying degrees of complexity throughout the physical world.
Okay.
Okay, so consciousness here is not necessarily referring to human consciousness.
Okay.
Okay, so his point is, if you're looking at something like a virus or a bacteria, it's a complex organism, self-sustaining configuration of forces of connection. The liaisons are what's holding the bacteria together. And there's many different bacteria, so they take different shapes. Same thing with viruses. Bacteria are made up of molecules, made up from atoms all the way to the subatomic level. Okay? So, what engenders the form is a consciousness, an activity. Now, is it a self-aware consciousness? Probably not. But this is the term that Ruyer uses. Okay? Remember what I was saying before about consciousness, at least the way I'm reading it in Ruyer, is the means by which things are stitched together.
Okay.
Okay? So there's not an element of randomness here. There maybe is some, and I put this in quotes, intentionality that is an operation, but it's hard to say. Again, Ruyer's point is that what's happening here is that there is a consciousness that is at work. Now, let's go back to another earlier point where he was avoiding the term panpsychism. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In the 19th century, the Romantics would have said, well, yes, this is panpsychism because there is some kind of a psychical process that is at work, forming the virus, the bacteria, the molecular level, and blah, 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 all of that. But he was avoiding that. Okay.
Right.
Preferring to use the term psychobiology, maybe that's a little more of a palatable term because he is a biologist.
Well, I was going to say in relation to that, it sort of sounds like applying intentionality to the scientific process.
Yes.
And,
yes.
Well, I should use the word consciousness because that's what
right, consciousness, not the scientific process, because the scientific process is still an abstraction, more or less. Mm-hmm. It's based on observation. That's one of the hallmarks of what science is. You observe phenomena, preferably in their natural state. Okay. But going back to the earlier point is that the scientific analysis of something is only looking at the structure and ignoring the form.
Right. So does he say why he views that as being conscious?
Well, again, how do you define conscious? So I read into this conscious is that, yes, there is some kind of a purposefulness. I think I like that term better than intentionality. A purposefulness at work in these liaisons, he calls them. Liaison is a French term meaning a connection.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So, continuing on, same paragraph, Bogue says, the amoeba, for example, is a self-sustaining form that exhibits the properties of a basic subjectivity. It is capable of autoconduction, of conditioned reflexes, of habits, of learning, and of adaptation, of instinctive actions appropriate to circumstances. That's true of an amoeba. And though it lacks the many specialized body components of a human being, including a central nervous system, its actions exhibit the primary characteristics of consciousness: perception, self-generated and goal-directed action, memory, learning, adaptation, and invention. Okay, so now he's getting down to what his definition of consciousness is. What human consciousness makes accessible to us, and hence knowable, if not observable as an external object, is the fundamental nature of form as a self-enjoying, absolute surface in auto-overflight, whose elements are connected through ongoing activity. It is this, our immediate experience of consciousness, that allows us to understand the amoeba, not as a mechanism, but as a living form. Okay?
Yeah, that's interesting.
So in other words, because we are aware of what consciousness is to us, first of all, we're assuming that there is such a thing as consciousness. We are moving away from consciousness of something, the Husserlian approach, intentionality and all that jazz, where consciousness is defined by perception, self-generated and goal-directed action, memory, learning, adaptation, and invention. Okay, we impute that to ourselves in human consciousness. So, if we see it, if we observe it in another organism, such as an amoeba, we understand the amoeba in those terms.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah. Yeah, this is really, I like his perspective on consciousness. It's really interesting.
Right. Now, in 20th century and 21st century philosophy, this is these kind of these predicates apply to consciousness about its perception, self-generated, goal-directed action, and so on and so forth. We still see these of what consciousness is. Okay, consciousness incorporates some memory. Consciousness incorporates some learning. Consciousness is kind of an umbrella term applied to all of these distinct mind actions. And now we're venturing in the philosophy of mind. Okay, but
Right.
again, what Ruyer is trying to do here is taking the definition of consciousness, using many different predicates here. We understand this about ourselves as conscious beings, and then we are imputing this understanding. An organism like an amoeba, which is about as low as you can get in a fundamental cellular level. We're not even looking at animals, where that's how we understand the amoeba, not as a mechanism, but as a living form.
Right.
Okay? So this is what he's getting at in terms of form. If we are taking the scientific tack and looking at it strictly on a scientific analysis, we're going to be looking at the structure and ignoring the form.
Right.
Okay? Saying that the amoeba is comprised of these cells, these molecules, and so on and so forth. That's the structure. Okay?
Right.
But then we're forgetting is that the amoeba is a form. The amoeba is something that possesses what we understand as consciousness.
Right.
Okay? Make sense so far?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, continuing, Bogue says, forms then extend from atoms to molecules to all the diverse types of organisms on our planet. All are living and all are manifestations of, quote, consciousness force. They are to be contrasted with aggregates, collections of disconnected forms. Such collections are not imbued with a single consciousness and overflight that would give them their own form. A bucket of sand is an aggregate. A cloud is an aggregate, as is a set of billiard balls on a pool table. Geological formations in general are aggregates, and that mountains, mesas, even planets are mere accretions of atoms and molecules that take on various shapes according to mechanical laws of adhesion, erosion, and so on. Many of the phenomena in our world involve the interaction of separate bodies as components of aggregates. Aggregates are structures rather than genuine forms, and hence they are observable. Their elements, relative positions to one another, and functions may be described, and the future states of their functioning may be predicted. Most of the advances of modern science have come through the study of aggregates, and they have given us invaluable knowledge about the world. But they have also encouraged a mechanistic view of reality as nothing but a collection of discrete objects interacting according to the laws of classical physics, which are laws governing aggregates. Ruyer recognizes the importance of the scientific study of aggregates, but argues that sciences based on such study are secondary sciences, whereas those that study forms are primary sciences.
So, what would he regard as primary sciences that study forms?
Biology.
Okay.
Okay. Again, we had just seen this with the amoeba.
Right.
Geology studies an aggregate because studying the Earth, or a planet, we'll say, exogeology, we wouldn't say that a planet is a form necessarily. We certainly wouldn't impute a planet having consciousness. Maybe
Right.
some woos out there would say that, the whole Gaia type of thing. But that's not where Ruyer is getting at here. Okay.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
see.
So continuing, classical mechanistic science, the science of aggregates, treats the structure and function of entities in terms of partes extra partes, interacting by contiguity, de ploche en ploche, the overall shape and regular operation of an entity, say a dog, emerging simply via the deterministic and theoretically predictable assemblage of machine-like constituents, atoms and molecules, interconnected solely via contact with their immediately surrounding co-constituents. Obviously, according to such a model, the whole is merely the sum of its parts. Okay. So if we're looking at something like a dog, most of the time we don't treat the dog as just an assemblage, as a collection of atoms and molecules.
That would be weird, especially if you treated other people like that.
That would be weird. That's right. However, that's what the classical mechanistic science does, and we treat human beings in that respect.
Mm.
As a collection of organs, which are in turn a collection of tissues, which is in turn a collection of atoms and molecules, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we're not going to treat Fido as that. Instead, we're treating Fido much like we do the amoeba, because again, as human beings with a consciousness, we understand that and impute that to the dog and understand the dog as something that possesses consciousness, a personality, and so on and so forth.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So, and again, that's a primary science, not a secondary science.
Right. Because it studies forms.
Right. Study forms. Now, in the next part, I'm not going to go too much into this. In the 40s and the 50s, there was something called Gestalt Theory. So Gestalt is a German term referring to, it's the German for form. Okay. So let's look at the chessboard or the checkerboard. Instead of looking at the chessboard or the checkerboard as just an assemblage of many different squares juxtaposed among one another, the Gestalt looks at the entire board.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Again, with the amoeba, with the dog, with the human being, this is where Gestalt comes in. You're looking at the Gestalt, the form. Okay.
Okay.
Also, Gestalt was a school of psychology. I think was popular in the 60s and the 70s. Just Gestalt referring to the human form, rather the composite form of the personality, instead of this is the mind or the personality separately, or repression, the Freudian approach to this thing. You're looking at the Gestalt of the person, whole person, you could even say.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So going to the next page, 306. For Ruyer, the difficulty faced by Gestaltists is that of deriving a living, self-sustaining form from the interaction of particles of brute matter according to the laws of a mechanistic physics. He sees the theories of emergence in general as further vain attempts to explain how lifeless, billiard ball-like atoms can somehow give rise to living organisms or sentient beings endowed with self-consciousness, as if in some way at various stages of organization, certain wholes suddenly take on properties that are qualitatively different from the functioning of separate parts. So in other words, he's criticizing emergence theory and emergent phenomena.
Right. Okay.
Ruyer sees no mystery in the development of life from inorganic matter or in the emergence of consciousness, since for him all genuine beings are alive in consciousness, in the sense that atoms, molecules, and organisms are all self-sustaining forms. He does, however, see a mystery in the origin of self-replicating forms, and especially those that undergo morphogenesis, meaning the emergence of a form. Forms that are born, grow, reproduce, and die. He makes no claim to having solved the mystery of how such forms came into being, but he does propose ways of understanding morphogenesis that expand our comprehension of consciousness and its relationship to biology. Okay, so let's unpack this a minute. He criticized the Gestaltists because the Gestalt meaning form, they are looking at things mechanistically. Here's a jumble of things in the physical world. Okay, so then the Gestalt is taking it as the form. The form is arising from this assemblage of whatever these physical forms are. And then they also introduce things like emergence. Okay, so the emergent phenomena thing. All right. Now we can shift gears a minute and move away from physics to look at maybe the social realm. So society is an emergent phenomenon. How so? Because society is something that results from the interaction of individuals, human beings in this case, in their day-to-day efforts. Okay. Now, focusing on the social, I think, is a better way of looking at this and explaining an emergent phenomena, but also in the sense that Ruyer is getting at, because if society emerges from the interaction of individual human beings, the individual human beings are already forms, endowed with a certain sense of consciousness and self-determination. Okay? See how this works?
Yes.
Okay. So getting back to the physical realm, Ruyer is saying moral is kind of in the same ballpark in talking about the individual persons, because you're not looking at things lifelessly. Even at the atomic level, there already is some kind of life that is going on here. They are alive and conscious, choosing, using that term reservedly, choosing to pair up, creating another form and moving together, and then separating and choosing to merge with something else to create another form. Okay, so there's no mystery there, it says, and that life emerges from inorganic matter. Now, also shifting gears, I think I mentioned this in the previous episode. Roger Penrose was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he has studied the phenomena of consciousness for many years. He gets down to the brain level. It's really an interesting interview. He gets down to the brain level, where there seems to be something going on at a very fundamental level within the brain that gives rise to consciousness, because those fundamental levels in the brain are themselves alive.
Okay.
Okay. It's really a fascinating theory when you hear him explain it.
Yeah.
But I think this really dovetails in nicely with what Ruyer is getting at here, that there's no mystery that life can arise from inorganic matter, because all genuine beings are alive in consciousness. However, when it comes to self-replicating forms, they born, grow, reproduce, and die. This is a mystery that he claims never to have solved.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. That's interesting.
Okay. So continuing, going to the next page, 307. Let's see. What was that one part here? Okay, so continuing with morphogenesis. So he's talking about shaping a hand. Okay, Bogue continues. He says, the hand is not formed simply like our snapshots on the timeline, point by point, de proche en proche, by an accretion of contiguities. Rather, the incipient hand and the completed hand are starting point and end point of a continuous line of development. That line best thought of as something like a musical melody. Okay, so a melody unfolds in time, moment by moment, but the listener only knows it fully when it is completed. Let me say this again. A melody unfolds in time, moment by moment, but the listener only knows it fully when it is completed, and only recognizes it as a genuine melody, as opposed to a random sequence of notes, when its overall design is grasped, that design or shape being immanent within the melody from beginning to end. In a sense, the melody as shape exists outside chronometric or measurable time, as an idea that manifests itself moment by moment in performance. I think I touched on this once before. Time is a key element in music. Music doesn't exist unless it's in time. However, the phenomena is, we know as listeners of music that is not just a random succession of notes. A melody emerges, is picked out, and the composer wrote the melody. He already heard the melody in his own head, wrote it on the music sheet, played around with it if it wasn't fully formed when it came out, and that's the melody. And we've heard many songs, many pieces in our lives where we can easily pick out the melody. We recognize it instantaneously. It exists within time. It is not a succession of notes unless we're learning it on a guitar, a piano, or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. I like that description of it. It's really interesting, especially since he used the word immanent, which is one of my favorite words now.
Oh, yes. It's a very Deleuzian phrase.
Yes.
Okay. So let's see. Okay, towards the end of that paragraph, Bogue says, hence, if a genuine form is a self-sustaining activity, an organism is a self-sustaining and self-shaping activity. And if a form is an absolute surface in auto-overflight, a self-forming form that builds itself, is an atemporal absolute surface in auto-overflight, unfolding chronologically as a developmental melody.
Cool.
Okay, so let's look at the human being. So the human being, from when it is born as an infant until at some point whenever it dies, sustains itself, shapes itself as an activity, because from the infant going into the child, into the teenager, into the adult, is shaping itself from something previously into something coming afterwards. You know, each one of us were infants, now we're adults. We sustain ourselves even though we take in food, but we are sustaining ourselves. You know, oxygen is getting processed, food is getting digested, helps sustaining ourselves, okay, as an organism.
Yeah.
So, and if a form, taking a human being as a form, is an absolute surface in auto-overflight, a self-forming form that builds itself is an atemporal absolute surface in auto-overflight, unfolding chronologically as a developmental melody. So we are unfolding through time as the melody, not just a succession of notes, but as something that is recognizable. You know, human development, born, infant, child, adult, later adult, old person, to the end. That's the melody. That's the melody. We've seen that not just with human beings, but also with other organisms.
And is there an added implication there, using the metaphor that you don't fully know what a person is until they die, basically, which is like the end of the melody?
Yes, that's a good way of looking at it.
Okay.
Yes, we had seen that earlier. So you don't know what the melody is until after you hear it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor.
Yeah. Okay. So then continuing, same page. Bogue says, Ruyer is not advocating a conventional idealism, we must note, for a developmental melody is not an idea residing in some ethereal great beyond. Okay, idealism meaning that everything exists within the mind. That's
Right.
not the case here. Rather, it never loses contact with the spatiotemporal plane, even though it is not constrained to actualize in space at every moment, the totality of the structure which it is capable of constructing. An embryo's conception, for example, its developmental melody exists largely as a potential form, only minimally actualized. But as the organism grows, the developmental melody becomes increasingly embodied in the spatiotemporal world. If the organism dies without reproducing, the developmental melody idea dies also. If the organism reproduces, however, the developmental melody continues, the self-forming formative activity enacting a succeeding organism's morphogenesis. Yet at no point is the idea form detached from the spatiotemporal world. Though actualized only by degrees during an organism's morphogenesis, the organism's idea form is immanent within the organism throughout its diverse actualizations and never totally separated from the actual organism.
Okay.
Okay,
So,
so let's unpack this.
yeah.
Okay, so again, mentioning about the melody. All right, so the melody exists within time. It also exists within space because the instrument, you hear the music from an instrument. Take your pick what it is. Electric guitar, four-piece band, marching band, piano, whatever it is. Okay, the instrument produces the notes, the vibrations in the air, and it exists within time. This is the spatiotemporal plane. Okay, the melody
Mhm.
doesn't exist within our minds alone. That would be conventional idealism. So then running with that melody idea for the development of the organism.
Wait, sorry. Could you remind me what exactly he means by spatiotemporal plane?
In space and time.
Okay.
Okay, the space-time.
Okay.
Okay, so again, saying at an embryo's conception, for example, its developmental melody exists largely as a potential form only minimally actualized. But as the organism grows, the developmental melody becomes increasingly embodied in the spatiotemporal world. Okay, so in other words, at the time of conception, afterwards, the embryo forms. Now, we've seen this before, is that whatever the embryo is, a human being, a dog, a cheetah, whatever it is, an embryo, we kind of know what the melody is going to be. But I mean, it's already implicit within the embryo. Now, something we do not know is how. Makes sense?
You cut out for about 5 seconds there.
Okay, let me say this again. So conception happens, the embryo results. The developmental melody is within the embryo, regardless of what the embryo is. Could be a human
Okay.
being, it could be some other organism or whatever it is. We kind of know what the melody is going to be. However, we don't know exactly what the melody is going to. We don't know exactly what the melody is going to be, how complex it will be, how long it will be, when it will end.
This is sounding more and more like the plane of immanence to me.
I think we're close. We have to get through the rest of the essay. Okay. But think about this. That's I really do like this metaphor too about a melody.
Yeah.
Okay. When you were conceived, a biologist would look at you and say, yeah, so it's a male embryo, it's going to follow a predictable melody turning into a male. Okay. But some things that they really could not predict how the melody was going to be is, if you study music, we're talking about major and minor. Okay. Maybe it was thought you were going to be major, but you actually turned out to be minor. For example, maybe you were going to turn out gay rather than straight.
Yeah.
We don't know. We don't know that at the time. We know that part of the melody is going to be, yeah, you're going to be born as an infant, as a male infant. Then you're going to be a male child, a male teenager, a male young adult, and so on. That's the general contours of the melody, but we don't know all of the twists and turns that the melody is going to have.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah. Yeah. Really, that's a perfect metaphor.
Yeah. And then the other point is, again, not the conventional idealism, yet at no point is the idea form detached from the spatio-temporal physical world. Though actualized only by degrees during an organism's morphogenesis, which is being born, growing, dying, the organism's idea form is immanent within the organism throughout its diverse actualizations and never totally separated from the actual organism.
Okay.
So that's immanence.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Next page. Bo continues. The developmental melody is best thought of as a musical theme in the process of forming itself as a variation of that theme. Let me say this again. The developmental melody is best thought of as a musical theme in the process of forming itself as a variation of that theme. Have you ever heard variations on a theme?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me go back to my example about you could have turned out gay rather than straight. If you had turned out gay, that's a variation on the theme.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Each organism that undergoes morphogenesis, each self-forming form, exhibits memory and invention in its development. A cat embryo possesses the memory of its catness and how to make itself into a cat. But its self-development is an action, a task, and a genuine process of invention, not fully predictable, open to disturbances, adjustments, and improvisation. The eventual mature cat being a novel variation of the catness immanent within its developmental melody.
Okay.
Okay. So
were developmental melodies interacting with the physical world if part of our immanence turns out to be that we are conscious beings, something like that?
no, not quite.
Okay.
So let me go back to the example of you, Andrew. Okay. So you were an embryo, a male embryo. You were identified as such. You have humanness and maleness. And I'm going to use the term loosely as like an essence rather than ness. Okay. Probably the better term to use here, although I didn't see this in this essay, but perhaps Deleuze would use this, is the hikeity. Remember that term? It's the thisness of something, not the essence, but the thisness. What makes object A this object is the hikeity.
What's the difference between that and an essence?
Because an essence, traditionally understood, is an unchanging part of whatever it is. There is an essence of a rock. There is an essence of a human being. There is an essence of a cloud. It's something that's unchanging, regardless of what it is. There could be variations of that thing, but getting down to brass tacks, there's something that's unchanging. But that's a problem because this goes back to ancient philosophy. How could you tweeze out an essence without it exhibiting a form? This is Aristotle's problem, the hylomorphic distinction. Hyle is the essence, the morphe is what form it takes. You can't take out of the rock the essence and throw it on the ground and say that's the essence. You just can't. Right. That's a problem. Okay.
Right.
So even thinking about something having an essence is already problematic. Talking about something having a thisness, you point to a rock and say this rock. Whatever makes it this rock, whatever configuration has taken place, distinguishes it from that rock, which itself has a hikeity. Now, hikeity is a medieval term that Deleuze appropriated.
Oh, okay. It sounds something like difference. Like this is what makes this rock this rock rather than that rock. rather than like this is the essence of what a rock is.
Exactly. Because if you're getting into essences, then you're straying into Platonism.
Okay.
The ideal form, the ideal essence, we're not even talking about that here.
Right.
Because what did we say at the very beginning? Deleuze is working against transcendence.
Right.
As understood in Plato's terms.
Right.
Rather in immanence. Okay. So going back to the catness here. So you, Andrew, had a humanness and you had a maleness. Okay. That was the melody implicit within you. We know that this is going to be a melody. However, it's going to be variations on the theme because we don't know what's going to happen to Andrew as he progresses through his life. And you're 30-something, so you've been on this earth for about 30-odd-some years. We could look back at how the melody is unfolded and see the variations on that theme. Okay. So you were a human male who turned out to have red hair. You were a human male. Well, it looks like you have red hair.
I have brown hair. It's a really bright light.
Okay, so you have brown hair. My mistake. So you turned out to have brown hair. You turned out to be of a certain height. You turned out to have a certain voice. That was internally within you, but also you turned out to be the person you did because of actions that you took in the past, things that you did in the past, circumstances that were beyond your control, and you had to address those circumstances or work within those kind of circumstances. You know, shit happens to you, bad luck, and then you had to abandon certain goals and go after new goals and so on and so forth. You know, all these are taking place, and all these are developing the variation on the theme.
Right.
Okay. So that's the developmental melody. Best thought of as a musical theme in the process of forming itself as a variation of that theme.
Okay.
Rather than thinking in terms of an essence where it was predetermined from the time that you were an embryo that you would turn out the way you did.
Right. I like that because it's less deterministic.
It's less deterministic, right. Okay, so then Bo continues, and a complex organism, such as a cat, is itself a hierarchy of self-sustaining and self-forming forms. Each of its organs, for example, is a self-forming form, which is under the dominance of the cat form. The cat is, as it were, a coordinated group project involving a hierarchy of agents. So the thing about the cat form is, a cat has a heart, a cat-like heart, which is not the same as a dog heart, a human heart, a bird heart, or something. It's still a heart, but it is unique to the cat. And is itself a self-forming form, because as we know from biology is that organs within a body, within an organism's body, are themselves made up of living tissue, regenerating themselves.
Right.
Okay? The line between organ and individual is not always easily drawn. And in fact, the hesitation between being an individual and being the organ of an individual is found throughout the organic domain. If, as Ruyer claims, every self-forming form is a subject, an I, then we may say of every human being, as of every complex living organism, I am made of all the other I's that I have already produced, as if though a sort of cellular division of internal and dominated reproduction. I am a colony, both psychological and biological. Given the colonial nature of hierarchically organized, complex self-forming forms, it is no wonder that morphogenesis entails risks, perils, improvisations, and invention.
Cool. I like that.
Okay? I am a colony, both psychological and biological.
Right.
Okay? So there's no essential I that has been there from the very beginning.
Right.
That would also entail there's no such thing as an unchanging self necessarily that has been there from the beginning.
Right. Yeah, of course.
Okay?
Because your self could have turned out very differently, as you were going into before.
Correct. Now, let's back up a minute here. So Ruyer was a philosopher of biology. Consciousness is not something that is distinctly mental.
Right.
It is something, he's getting down to the biological level. And everything else seems to follow from him being at the biological level.
Right.
The morphogenesis of an organism. Okay. All right. So then continuing. Next paragraph. Ruyer finds evidence against pre-formationism and in favor of morphogenetic invention and improvisation and the phenomenon of equipotentiality, which is equal potentiality, potential forces, equal. Early in embryological studies, researchers found that grafting cells from one sector of an embryo into another, or from other embryos, even in some cases from embryos of different though closely related species, did not necessarily disrupt normal morphogenesis. If the graft was made early in development, the cell often simply assumed the function appropriate to its new location in the embryo. If, however, the graft was made later in development, the grafted cell developed as if it were in its old position. This suggested that initially embryonic cells are equipotential, capable of developing in a number of ways, to become a lung, a foot, or an eye, and that as development proceeds, cells become more specific in their function, such that at a certain point a given cell might be capable of forming only a limb, or even later, of forming only a right thumb.
Right.
Okay. Now, where have we seen this recently? In the past, I'd say decade or 2 decades. Stem cells.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. So what is it about stem cells? Stem cells, you could grow different organisms from the same cell. Early on, okay, his point was that if you make the graft early on in the embryo, it's just absorbed by everything else within the embryo and then becomes part of it. But at a later point, once the embryo has already been developed, then there's some problems. Okay. Now, to give another point, the problems that had existed early on with organ transplantation. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why is that? Because organs are already fully developed. So, if you needed a kidney transplant, the doctor's not going to take a cat kidney and put it in your body because you're not of the same species. You need a human kidney, but that doesn't mean that your body is going to accept the kidney. If you get it from a relative, the chances are higher that your body will accept that new kidney versus from somebody else.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one thing. That's one thing to consider. Also, if you can't get it from a relative, then you would get it from somebody who is a matching donor.
Yeah, matching blood type, right? Matching
blood type, or if the kidney is healthy, if it wasn't damaged by something like disease or abuse. Look at liver transplants. The reason why people get liver transplants is because of hepatitis and because they might have cirrhosis because they were an alcoholic for so many years. Right. In fact, my girlfriend and I know somebody who just had a liver transplant.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So continuing, Ruyer sees an equipotentiality, simply another name for consciousness, or a self-forming form, an auto-overflight of an absolute surface. And he regards morphogenesis as an incremental specification of areas of restricted potentiality as the organism takes place. Something of the embryo's equipotentiality continues to exist in the diverse components of an organism, in that development never ceases while the organism lives, even if that development is in a steady state of maintenance, repair, and regular cell replacement, or in a state of decline as death approaches. Given that equipotentiality is but another name for consciousness, Ruyer can say of the various components of an organism, quote, each area is equipotential in itself, and to each equipotentiality corresponds a precise consciousness. But Ruyer argues as well that in humans, at least, a good deal of equipotentiality continues to exist in the brain throughout an individual's life. Hence, the brain is an embryo that has not completed its growth. The embryo is a brain which begins to organize itself before organizing the external world.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and read that again. Ruyer can say of the various components of an organism, each area is equipotential in itself, and to each equipotentiality corresponds a precise consciousness. But Ruyer argues as well that in humans, at least, a good deal of equipotentiality continues to exist in the brain throughout an individual's life. Hence, the brain is an embryo that has not completed its growth. It's kind of true because the brain is, as you started from an infant going into a child, you're learning all the time. Your brain is expanding. The neurons are firing up. Some neurons will die off because it reaches a steady state. But that doesn't mean your brain is still not changing.
For
And in
sure.
fact, if you have a serious injury or something happens like you lose your sight, your brain will reorient itself to compensate for the loss of that organ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for
Okay.
sure.
It's an embryo that has not completed its growth. The embryo is a brain which begins to organize itself before organizing the external world. Now, what does that tell us? Something that you read from this is, it's not necessarily deterministic, but running with the melody metaphor, which I still think is a really good one,
Yeah.
is that whatever the embryo is, say of a cat, dog, human being, or whatever it is, okay, we know how the melody will play out according to a variation. Now, as it organizes itself, then that organism in turn will organize the external world for it. Okay. What does that tell you? So, our understanding of consciousness in ourselves, imputing that to other organisms, we impute that consciousness understanding to other organisms. However, the catch is we must not make the mistake that how we organize the world as human beings is not the same as how a dog would organize the world, or how a whale would organize the world, or how an insect would organize the world.
How would they organize the world?
I think they would, because all organisms have to survive. And they organize the world in order that they may survive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We human beings can create symphonies. Dogs don't.
Mm-hmm.
We organize the world through a symphony or by music. Dogs don't.
Yeah.
Whales don't, even though one could say, particularly in the cases of whales, they can create music. Whale song, for example.
True. Good
Dogs
point.
barking. Wolves, who are very closely related to dogs, howling, means of communication. This is their way of organizing the world. So again, we should not make the mistake that, well, actually, there was an earlier mistake going back to Descartes' time, where animals were just seen as automatons, machines.
Right.
Okay. So we've moved past that past that mistake, but do not make the mistake that how a human being organizes the world is the same as how another organism arranges or organizes the external world.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. All this making sense so far?
Yeah.
All right. So that's everything about Ruyer. Let's shift gears and go into Deleuze. Okay. Same page 310. Okay. Bogue says, in the paragraph of difference and repetition that opens, the entire world is an egg, Deleuze makes use of Ruyer's analysis of embryological equipotentiality in remarking that when a cellular migration takes place, as Raymond Ruyer shows, it is the requirements of a role, insofar as this follows from a structural theme, to be actualized which determines the situation, not the other way around. Deleuze adds a footnote to this sentence, observing that Ruyer, no less than Bergson, profoundly analyzed the notions of the virtual and actualization. Aha, the virtual. His entire biological philosophy rests upon them, along with the idea of the thematic. Okay, remember we had seen the virtual and the actualization before with Deleuze, very important.
Mm-hmm.
The virtual is no less real, even though it is not actualized, for example.
Right, right.
Okay, this is indeed a fair appraisal of Ruyer's biological philosophy, though Ruyer speaks most often of the actualization of potential rather than virtual forms. But whether termed potential or virtual, what is crucial is that Ruyer distinguishes between the vertical domain of self-forming forms and the horizontal domain in which they're actualized. Just as Deleuze maintains that the virtual and the actual are both real, and that the virtual is immanent within the actual, so Ruyer insists that self-forming forms are real and immanent within their actualizations. Remember, there's nothing transcendental here. At times in difference and repetition, Deleuze speaks of the virtual in terms of ideas, capital I, as problems, and Ruyer likewise refers to self-forming forms as ideas, small I, stressing that such ideas are not static Platonic forms, but thematic activities, goal-directed projects that constantly require improvised solutions to unanticipated problems.
Right.
Okay, so not a Platonic form. There is an idea, something we could term as an idea, according to Ruyer, that is a thematic activity for the self-forming form. Goal-directed projects requiring improvised solutions to unanticipated problems. So as the organism is directed towards something, say, finding food or water. Say you're a deer in the forest. Okay, you're looking for water because you're thirsty. That's your goal. As you're moving through the forest, you are coming across unanticipated problems. There's a fence in your way. There's a wall in your way. There's a predator nearby. You need to change. You still have your goal in mind, but all kinds of things pop up on the way going towards your goal.
Right.
Same thing for human beings. We have goals. Some of them are concrete. I need to go get a glass of water, so I'm going into the bathroom or the kitchen to get myself a glass of water. That's a goal-directed activity.
Yeah.
There's probably going to be anticipated problems, but very unlikely. For something that's abstract, such as this is the person that I want to be 5 years from now, that's a goal-directed project that requires improvisation to any kinds of unanticipated problems. And more than likely, who we thought we wanted to be 5 years from now, once we get there, it might be something completely different.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. So continuing, next page 311. Bogue says, Deleuze and Guattari cite Ruyer in Anti-Oedipus, the first book of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, in the course of reiterating the differences between the molar and the molecular. Their formulation of the opposition adheres closely to Ruyer's distinction between molar aggregate structures and genuine forms, the latter being manifest at the molecular level and maintained in every self-forming form, whatever its size or complexity. Deleuze and Guattari correctly note that these themes are developed by length by Ruyer in Neo-Finalism, is one book. Ruyer states here, for example, that a field of consciousness or of subjectivity is a domain of liaisons, connections, according to which model we must conceive the domains of microscopic liaisons that assure the coherence of physical individualities. Since all organisms are made up of atoms and molecules, we may say that the elephant is, if you will, a macro-microscopic being. Whatever the actual scale of the entities under consideration, there is a qualitative difference between forms and aggregates. The one manifest even in an individual atom, the other evident only in assemblages of forms, such assemblages at any given scale always being macroscopic in relation to the microscopic forms that constitute the given aggregate. Okay? So, By extension, any kind of an organism is a macro-microscopic being. How so? Because at the microscopic level, we are talking about self-forming forms, even at the atomic level. But these forms coming together to form an elephant, to form a human being, to form a cat or a dog, at the macro level is an assemblage of a form. Okay?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
So this one term, molar, in Capitalism and Schizophrenia, the molar refers to the macro. The molecular refers to the microscopic.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So if we're talking about society, to go back to that example, when we speak of society as an assemblage, we're speaking at the molar level.
Right.
That's it in a nutshell. We won't get into the nitty-gritty about this.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay, we'll go ahead and skip page 312, going to page 313. Beau continues. Deleuze claims Ruyer as the latest of let me read this again. Deleuze claims Ruyer as the latest of Leibniz's great disciples. And although Ruyer frequently expresses his differences with Leibniz, he would no doubt have welcomed the accolade, especially since Deleuze's reading of Leibniz's thought makes evident its similarities with Ruyer's own. Okay. One of the problems Leibniz addresses is the relationships among hierarchically organized monads. Okay, now what's a monad? So a monad is analogous to an atom. In Leibniz's metaphysics, the monads are self-contained and they are, one could say, conscious. Yeah, we're going to use Ruyer's language here. They are conscious and goal-directed, self-contained. But they're not inorganic, lifeless, and non-purpose-directed atoms in that understanding. Okay, that's what a monad is.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Also, since Leibniz believed in God, God is the being, we'll say, that organizes the monads together.
Okay.
Okay. So, one of the problems Leibniz addresses is the relationships among hierarchically organized monads, specifically those among dominating and dominated monads, such as the various monads of a human body's organs that are dominated by the monad of the body as a whole. Okay. Deleuze pursues this question at length, as well as the related issue of how, why, and in what way monads have bodies, offering an ingenious reading of Leibniz that provides significant tools for approaching the thorny issue of what constitutes a biological individual. Deleuze's analysis of the dimension of Leibniz's thought could well guide one in extending Ruyer's theory of forms into this largely unexamined region of his thought. Continuing. Intimations of Ruyer appear early in What is Philosophy, one of Deleuze and Guattari's last books, when Deleuze and Guattari state that the concept is in a state of survey in relation to its components. Survey is a translation of the French cerveau, which we already found in Ruyer as a, what was the term he used? Overflight. Okay. Is in a state of survey in relation to its components. But it is only in the book's concluding chapter that they explicitly refer to Ruyer. There they characterize the brain as the junction, not the unity, of the three planes, of philosophy, the arts, and the sciences. And they argue that the brain is a Ruyerian form. Scientific descriptions of the brain typically follow two models, conceiving of neural connections either as pre-established or as produced and broken up in fields of forces, and treating processes of integration as either localized hierarchical centers or as forms, Gestalten. Remember we had the term Gestalt? Yet both schemas presuppose a plane, not an end or a program, but a survey of the entire field. This is what Gestalt theory does not explain, any more than mechanism explains pre-assembly. Okay. So we need to unpack this. So in One of Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari, they speak of the three planes: philosophy, the arts, and the sciences. Philosophy's plane has a certain way of looking at things. Arts has another way of looking at things. The sciences have another way of looking at things. So they're saying that the brain is the junction and not the unity of the three planes. One can describe the brain according to philosophy, or to the arts, or to the sciences. It's not a unity, but whatever plane you are using to describe can describe the brain as. You can think in terms of 3 dimensions. Okay. So when you're talking about 3 dimensions, they are separate dimensions that are all to junction and not necessarily unity.
Yeah.
Okay. So, continuing on, whenever science describes the brain, it uses 2 models: neural connections that are pre-established, or is produced and broken up in fields of forces. This part of the brain, these neurons are interacting in a certain way. This part of the brain, these neurons are interacting in a certain way. Fields of forces. Okay. Treating the processes of integration as either localized hierarchical centers, such as the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the hippocampus. That's a localized hierarchical center. Or as a form, a gestalt. This form of the brain. The primitive brain. The higher brain, or things like that. So any of those schemas that they use presupposes a plane of the entire field. Okay.
Right.
So if you're describing something scientifically, you are deploying the scientific plane, and you are describing the brain in terms of science.
Right.
You are not describing it in terms of philosophy, and you are not describing it in terms of the arts.
Yeah. You're describing it in terms of one of the 3 planes.
That's right, which is a survey of the entire field. So a plane, let's run with a geographic metaphor here. I touched on this before. In geometry, the definition of a plane is something that exists in 2 dimensions and it has no end. It stretches out infinitely. Okay?
Right.
When you mark off a certain shape, say a square, in 2-dimensional space, the square exists on the plane.
Yeah.
Okay? So if we run with this, science is a plane. You draw your little square, and this is biology. Okay, this is one of the sciences within the entire plane of science. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Again, this is what Gestalt Theory, which is looking at the form, does not explain any more than mechanism explains pre-assembly.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So remember that Ruyer was working against the Gestaltists because the Gestaltists tried to introduce emergence from lifeless and organic matter. But Ruyer says that it's no surprise that this kind of thing emerges because organisms are themselves living, as is a lot of reality is living, because of the connection, the choice, quote unquote choice, of the molecules as they form.
Right. Right.
Okay. So next page 314. Bo continues. The brain in its guise as absolute form appears as the faculty of concepts, proper to philosophy. In this role, the brain is the mind itself, a subject, or rather superject, as Whitehead puts it. This is a term that Alfred North Whitehead come up with, a superject. So a superject is something that is outside of a subject.
Oh, okay.
Okay. The brain of the arts involves a process of contraction that is the correlate of the survey, this brain subject being called soul or force, not a superject, but an inject coming within. The brain of the arts is one that contracts sensations, and that contraction of sensations takes place not only in humans, but throughout the physical world. Not every organism has a brain, and not all life is organic, but everywhere there are forces that constitute microbrains, or an inorganic life of things. And the brain of the sciences is neither a form nor a force, but a function. And in this capacity, the subject now appears as an eject.
What does an eject mean?
What do you do when you eject something?
You remove it.
You throw it out.
Throw it out. Okay.
Right. But this throwing out is, science is looking at the subject as something that is external.
Okay.
Okay. So let's go over this again. There's a lot here. So again, we're talking about the three planes: philosophy, arts, science. Okay. So when you're talking about the brain on the plane of philosophy, it's the faculty of concepts. Now, in what is philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari really stress that the purpose of philosophy, its role, is to create concepts, not discover concepts, but create concepts.
Right. Right.
Okay. So the brain on the plane of philosophy is the creator, is the faculty of concepts. It comes up with concepts. The concept of the external world, the concept of the subject, the concept of time, of space, and so on.
Right.
Okay. So in this role, the brain is the mind itself, a subject, or rather superject. Okay.
Right.
So it is become the subject, the superject, not something that is external, but something that is above in a way.
Right.
Okay.
So is that transcendent, or is that meant to be immanent, because we're talking about Deleuze's perspective, Deleuze and Guattari's perspective?
Well, it depends on how you define transcendent. Now, remember, within the concept of Deleuze, he doesn't strictly avoid using the term transcendent, but he uses it in a very special way. Transcendent is not Platonism.
Right.
A supersensory realm that exists apart from physical reality. Okay. Transcendent might refer to something a la Kant, which is providing the grounding for an operation that takes place within the mind, the transcendental unity of apperception, the transcendental deduction. Okay. Such things.
Okay.
For Deleuze, it's immanence. But when we're talking about a subject, remember what we talk about in philosophy. Lots of times you talk about the subject or the self or the mind or whatever it is. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're not even talking about the brain in philosophy. Philosophers really don't talk about the brain unless they're, related to cognitive science or something. Philosophers always talk about mind, but what is the mind? The mind is an operation. It may or may not be part of the brain. They tend to forget about that. Same thing with the subject. The subject has a mind, or the subject is doing this. The subject has experienced this, and so on and so forth. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, that's the brain on the philosophical plane. On the arts plane, the brain of the arts involves a process of contraction that is the correlate of the survey. This brain subject being called soul or force, not a superject, but an inject. The brain of the arts is one that contracts sensations, and that contraction of sensations takes place not only in humans, but throughout the physical world.
Right.
Okay. So about forces. Not every organism has a brain, and not all life is organic, but everywhere there are forces that constitute microbrains, or an inorganic life of things.
Right.
And what does the artist do? The artist taps into these sensations.
Right.
Okay. Then, on the scientific plane, the brain is neither a form nor a force, but a function. And in this capacity, the subject now appears as an eject. Okay. So it then becomes a subject of study.
Right.
All right. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So continuing on, Bogue says, rather than asserting that man thinks, not the brain, Deleuze and Guattari declare, it is the brain that thinks and not man, the latter being only a cerebral crystallization. Okay, let me read this again. It is the brain that thinks and not man, the latter being only a cerebral crystallization.
So our bodies or cells are crystallizations of our brains?
Yes, that could be it. This is the operation of subjectivity. Okay. So let's go back a minute. On the philosophical plane, we talk about subjects. On the philosophical plane.
Yeah.
Now, we have a brain. We know that there's some kind of a connection between ourselves, the I, sense of self, philosophically speaking, that is kind of connected to the brain. But what is it that's doing the thinking here? Ruyer asserts, so the conventional understanding is that man thinks, not the brain. However, the brain thinks and not man. So man, as a subject of study, is a product of the brain.
Right.
Quite possibly ourselves is a subject of the brain, or
Right.
is an operation of the brain, a cerebral crystallization. We have this thing called man or human being that is, in some form or fashion, a result of what the brain is doing. Possibly the sense of self that we have is an operation of the brain. We just don't completely understand it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so then continuing, philosophy, the arts, and the sciences are not the mental objects of an objectified brain, but the three aspects under which the brain becomes subject: thought brain. The thought brain of philosophy bears on the virtual domain of events, which Deleuze and Guattari describe as forms of a thought nature that surveys every possible universe. Okay.
What
Now
do they mean?
we saw in previous essays about events. The event was important for Deleuze. Same thing for virtual. The virtual domain of events. The events have not yet actualized.
Right.
Okay. The thought brain of philosophy bears on the virtual domain of events, which Deleuze and Guattari describe as forms of a thought nature that surveys every possible universe. Beau continues, what the phrase thought nature suggests, I believe, is that Deleuze and Guattari share Ruyer's view that human cognition, and specifically the practice of philosophy, is a highly specialized manifestation of the phenomenon of auto-overflight, of an absolute surface that is everywhere present in the world. Okay, auto-overflight is the translation of survol, the French word survol, which also is translated as a survey. It is something that is emerging from the self-organization of the organism.
So, by surveying all possible universes, is that sort of the immanence aspect of it?
Well, it is taking place in immanence. It's taking place in this plane.
Okay.
Remember, this is not happening in the transcendental realm.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
So let's read this once more. Human cognition, and specifically the practice of philosophy, is a highly specialized manifestation of the phenomenon of auto-overflight, of an absolute surface that is everywhere present in the world.
Right.
Okay. The practice of philosophy. Philosophy is it is a specialized thing that not everybody has the interest, much less the chops to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think everybody's capable of understanding philosophy to a certain degree. Creating new concepts, that's a different story.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, going to the next page, 315. Okay, Beau continues. Ruyer rejects vitalism by making living force, consciousness force, a constituent of matter, rather than some mysterious life force added to inert matter. This is what vitalism is, basically. That there is some kind of vital force even in inert matter. A rock has a vital force to it.
Okay.
So he rejects that. The living force, consciousness force, is a constituent of matter rather than some mysterious life force added to inert matter. So the consciousness force is already in, say, a rock. Okay. But as we saw before, this kind of makes sense in lines with his philosophy, is that when you're getting down to the microscopic level, to the atomic level, atoms, molecules already have that consciousness force in that they are, quote, choosing to stick together in such a sense where the rock gets produced or some kind of inert matter.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
But for him, the primary enemy is mechanism, and hence he wages a relentless battle against the notion of the organism as a machine. Deleuze, by contrast, embraces the machine model, though he does frequently caution that the machinic is not mechanistic, and that what we usually call machines are mere technological machines, a subset of the general category. When he and Guattari first introduced the machine model in Anti-Oedipus, their primary goal is to counter psychoanalysis's humanism and its obsession with signifiers and interpretation. But the machine model also undermines distinctions between psyche and body, and between body and world. There is no such thing as either man or nature, Deleuze and Guattari claim. Only a process that produces the one within the other and couples the machines together. Producing machines, desiring machines everywhere, schizophrenic machines of all species life. Okay?
So is the way that the machine model is different from a mechanistic approach is that there is like there's not a difference between there's not as much of a difference between the things that are interacting with each other, or like between the mind and the body and that sort of thing?
Well, there's a subtle difference here. Okay, this is where it kind of gets confusing. So, Ruyer was against mechanism. Okay, we saw this early on in the essay. Why are you against mechanism? Because you're treating everything as inert matter, more or less. Even if you're looking at an organism, say a dog, cat, human being, or whatever it is, you're saying that it's just a conglomeration of certain molecules, atoms that themselves have no consciousness. They're just randomly thrown together, and then hocus pocus, presto magico, here comes the organism. Okay, that's a mechanistic approach. The problem with mechanism is that it really sucks the life out of reality.
Yeah.
That's mechanism. Okay. However, Ruyer rejects vitalism. So vitalism is something that you already add to inert matter. That's not the case, because the consciousness force, the term he uses, is already existing in inert matter. Okay, we got that out of the way.
Right.
But again, the mechanism is that it is not mechanical. I mean, that's very closely related. It's not mechanical. So where the difference is when you're talking about a machine, so Ruyer is working against the notion of a machine, but Deleuze is not. Deleuze and Guattari. They appropriate machinic because what is a machine? A machine is not a technological machine necessarily, like a car, a computer, or something like that. That's a technological machine. That's a subset. But a machine itself is something that is it operates according to certain processes and certain procedures. Okay.
Right.
A machine could be something abstract.
Okay.
So then this is where they come up with the term, you see this a lot in Capitalism and Schizophrenia, a producing machine, a desiring machine, a schizophrenic machine.
Okay.
Machine meaning something that like schizophrenia, even though cautioning is that their definition of schizophrenia is in the psychoanalytic approach. Now, I remember seeing this when one of Cuck Philosophy's videos, where he put a disclaimer towards the end to avoid any kind of complaints that people were going to have. Is that, well, my brother is a schizophrenic and he's on medication. How dare that you say that schizophrenic is like this? No. We're only approaching this from a theoretical perspective. Schizophrenic meaning a split personality. This is what the original definition of schizophrenia was. It was a psychological disturbance. Yes, there are problems in the brain that result in schizophrenia. We know this. Okay. But back to the original point is that a schizophrenic is a machine, a schizophrenic machine, or or a schizophrenic operation that is machine-like. Okay, does this make sense?
Yeah, like like it's being used as a metaphor to explain like the two contradictory natures going against each other or something like that, right?
Right. We're not talking about a mechanism. We're talking about a machine. A machine, again, as I said, it could be something that is physical or it could be something that is abstract. But we're not necessarily talking about a technological machine, which is the common understanding when you say how would you define a machine? They cite something like an engine.
Right.
Okay. That's a technological machine.
Right.
They don't think that something like desire is a machine.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And like it sounds like machine also means like the thing, like the thing that compels you toward desire in that example, as if you were a machine just seeking it without any control or something like that.
Yes, and that's what their point was in Anti-Oedipus, where, as Bogue says here, is that they are countering psychoanalysis' humanism and its obsession with signifiers and interpretation. So Anti-Oedipus is against Freud, more or less, because what was Freud all about, really? He is about plumbing the depths of the unconscious, symptoms as a signifier, and interpreting those signifiers.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's something mysterious going on within the unconscious that one can only interpret through dream analysis. Okay.
Right.
Also, a humanistic approach. The person has an unconscious. That's what they're doing away with here. Rather, they are looking at things in terms of machine processes, taking the humanism out of this. Now, they're not the only ones to do something like that. There are some philosophers, psychoanalysts, and so on that are anti-humanistic. They look at things in terms of forces, that how human beings conduct themselves in the world is not necessarily of their own accord. We don't choose to act the way we do necessarily.
Right.
That's not to say we're deterministic. Far from it. Just that, again, we don't conduct ourselves in the world consciously all the time and making always rational choices.
Right. Right.
That's all part of the explanation.
Okay. So we can be machines in the sense that we can be compelled towards things beyond our control, but it's not deterministic because we're still looking at this within the perspective of immanence. So there could be very many different possibilities, to go back to that other metaphor, that could lead to what the melody that you can finally be defined as when you die.
No, I think you're stretching back too far.
No?
Here.
Okay.
No. Let's just go ahead and press on with the machine metaphor.
That's the weed talking.
That's the weed talking, yeah. Weed's a machine, man.
Yeah.
Okay, next page.
Tell them what I'm buying you for Christmas.
Oh, yeah, my parents are going to buy me a new bong for Christmas.
Okay. Okay. Is that going to be a transcendental bong or an immanent bong?
Oh, I view it as an immanent bong, but who knows? Depends on how high I get from it. Could be transcendental.
That's right. The closer you get to Christmas, the more imminent the bong is, because one day you will open the present.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, page 316. Bo continues. So in 1,000 Plateaus, which is the second volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Deleuze and Guattari avoid the terms subject, mind, and consciousness when characterizing nature. And in what is philosophy, also those terms are largely absent. It is significant, however, that the brain is said to operate, if not as a subject, a concept replete with undesirable philosophical associations. Yeah, no shit. Then as a superject, inject, or eject. And that each agent is, respectively, an esprit, which is the French term for mind or spirit. Coincidentally, esprit can be translated either way, just as the German term Geist can be translated either way.
The Geist can be translated as either mind or spirit?
That's right. There's not a distinction as there is in English, because in English, when you talk about the mind, it is something that is different from the spirit, although sometimes they two can be conflated.
Okay.
In French, esprit could mean either one. In German, Geist could mean either one.
Okay.
Okay. Now let's go back to these terms: the superject, which is the brain on the philosophical plane; the inject, the brain on the artistic plane; and the eject, the brain on the scientific plane. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Each agent is respectively an esprit, an âme, which is the French for soul or a function. So, esprit, how the brain is philosophically; the soul, how the brain is artistically; the function, how the brain is scientifically. This description of what one would assume to be the physical brain, in terms of such seemingly mental agencies as superjects, injects, and ejects, and such supernatural entities as spirits and souls, is finally just one more effort to escape mechanism and dualism. In this instance, by thwarting mechanism's tendency to see all physical entities, including the brain, as nothing but assemblages of deterministic psychochemical processes. Now we see why we're getting away from mechanism. Ultimately, what Deleuze and Guattari and Ruyer are trying to do is to develop new concepts of matter and life. For Ruyer, every entity that has genuine being is at once matter and mind, form and force, a consciousness force matter form, actively sustaining and forming itself. For Deleuze, the world is an egg, but it is also a machine, as well as a brain that operates as a spirit superject, soul inject, or function eject. For Ruyer, as for Deleuze and Guattari, matter is always formed by forces of liaisons and auto-overflight. And life is, in Deleuze and Guattari's terminology, anorganic, in that it is present in organic and inorganic molecules alike. Thus, I would conclude that though Deleuze is no mere disciple of Ruyer, his fundamental views of nature and those of Ruyer are broadly consonant with one another. And although Deleuze's explicit references to Ruyer are few, it is safe to say that Ruyer's philosophy of biology was an essential and far-reaching stimulus in the development of Deleuze's conception of nature, and perhaps in the formation of his ontology as a whole.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
The end.
Okay. Cool.
Okay?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm fascinated by the way that Raymond Ruyer looks at consciousness. I've never heard about that way of looking at it before. It's very interesting.
Hadn't either, except I mentioned this. I mentioned this earlier on. Is that when Ruyer was talking about organisms having consciousness, this is what prompted me. This is what made me remember about Dennett and the intentional stance, which was intentionality ascribed to organisms in terms of the purposeness of their actions.
Right.
Okay. Now, again, it's been some time since the last read the intentional stance. He was approaching it, as he always has been, as like a cognitive science, philosopher of mind, and so on and so forth. He probably would have balked at the explanation of consciousness, because then you're starting to get woo, whatever it was.
Yeah.
However, the thing about consciousness is there's some kind of a purposefulness that is at work here when you're saying that an organism does exhibit consciousness, not just human beings and not just things like dogs or cats, but even something like an amoeba exhibits consciousness. And again, as I had mentioned before, we as conscious beings, understanding the predicates that the many different predicates that are of consciousness, we impute this to the organism, understanding that it's exhibiting something that we would call consciousness.
Right.
Okay.
Well, yeah. So, yeah, I think just to sum up, I think that's the main takeaway I took from this was Royer's way of looking at consciousness and Deleuze and Guattari's thoughts on it.
Right.
Yeah, that's really
Yeah.
interesting.
Also, the fascinating part, the more that I encounter this, the more fascinated I am by what is philosophy, their late book, because of the three planes that they talk about. Now, just to reiterate once more with a better understanding, is that the brain on the philosophical plane is the self or is the mind or the subject. Okay, the brain on the artistic plane is the soul. When our artists talk about one's soul, the soul of the music comes from deep within my soul, or whatever it is, you're speaking on the artistic plane.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the scientific plane is the function, brain functions.
Right.
Brain operations.
Right.
Okay.
So the brain, the soul, and its functions.
No, not the soul. Not the soul. When you talk about the soul, you're on the artistic plane.
No, I mean all three planes.
Right. All three planes are not, as they defined it, is that it is not the unity. It's the juncture of the three planes.
Right. Okay.
Big difference there.
Yeah. That's important to remember. Okay. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks, as always, for another fascinating and educational episode. And thanks to everyone else who watches this. Hope you find it as interesting as we did. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. And also, thanks to everyone who likes, shares this video, subscribes to my channel, and especially to those of you who subscribe to me on Patreon. And what's the who is the next delusional episode about, Tim?
Heidegger.
Oh, cool. That'll be awesome.
Oh yes, we're getting into real head stretching stuff there.
Yeah.
Not that we haven't done so in the past several essays with this collection, but
yeah, for sure. All right.
Heidegger's the big man on campus.
Yeah. He's a really fascinating thinker.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching again, and adios until next time.